right, my name is Brian. My article critique is going to be on an article called The Effects of Yoga on Stress and Psychological Health Among Employees, an 8 and 16-week intervention study. This article was published in Anxiety, Stress, and Coping. I believe that fits pretty well. Yoga is a good way of coping with stress and anxiety, so it seems to fit perfectly. The abstract, it was broken down into all the portions of the paper, and it clearly talked about everything that was in the paper in the abstract. So, let's see, the title doesn't do a very good job of accurately reflecting the design or results or conclusions of the study, and that's on them, so we'll move on. Introduction. What is known and unknown about the topic? Work stress has negative effects on psychological, physiological health, on job performance, and yoga can offer a possible coping mechanism for that. One thing I noticed that no studies were presented that possibly refuted the stress relieving effects of yoga. They only presented studies that backed up their claims. And one of the problems discussed about the current literature is that there's little research done on the effects of yoga in non-clinical settings, and the authors wanted to examine the effects of common, everyday, you have easy access to a gym yoga on stress reduction and whatnot. What is a presented research question? All right, they wanted to examine the effects of common gym yoga on stress reduction and psychological health among non-clinical individuals. And the type of study used was a randomized, controlled, short-term, crossover follow-up design. Hope you got all that. Moving on. Their hypothesis was that yoga sessions that they did twice a week over an 8-week or 16-week period would have positive effects on reducing stress and increased psychological health and well-being among these employees. They're hoping that the results are going to be more generalizable, considering that it's not in clinical settings, that it's in your real-world setting. The study population, they used employees from a large university. They had well-stated inclusion and exclusion criteria that you can see here. Again. They did a good job of describing the subject population. They didn't do it in the methods section. They did it in the study design section, which was odd, but they did have plenty of descriptive data for their study pop, and it was a good pop to use to answer the research question. Is this sample appropriate and the right size? I believe the size seems sufficient. They had 80 people that they got demographic information from. Let's see. But the only issue is it may only be generalizable to employees of higher education, not necessarily other professions. The research design, like I said, is a randomized controlled trial, which is an experimental design. It was mixed between within subject design with repeated measures involving 3 data collection time points, and the 2 groups were a 16-week yoga group and then a group that they called a weight cross group, where they did do nothing for the first 8 weeks and then they participated in the yoga sessions for the last 8 weeks. The data is primary because they collected data themselves, and the analysis was a self-reported numerical rating system from the questionnaires that they did. Let's see. And the research design is appropriate given the research question. I covered that. They had clearly stated independent variables and dependent variables. The independent being, the yoga intervention, specifically power yoga is what they use, because apparently that's at most gyms. And then the timing of the intervention, as we discussed. And the dependent variables are all the psychological health markers of perceived stress and anxiety and whatnot that you can see here. Continuing on with methods, the measuring techniques that they use for the dependent variables to get all the anxiety results or anxiety data that they needed. They used a series of questionnaires listed here. These questionnaires all had good validity and reliability. They did these questionnaires at pre-intervention before anything, at the 8-week mark where the Waycross group there crossed over into the intervention group, and also at the end of the 16 weeks. Accounting for confounding factors, luckily randomized controlled trials seem to do a good job of that. They provide an unbiased distribution of confounders and assumes that both groups are identical. But some possible confounding factors are they thought that perhaps the Waycross group during their waiting period may have looked up information on yoga and meditation and whatnot, and that could have affected their outcomes. And they also believe that females tend to be more biased towards using something like yoga to help with these effects. Moving on to the results, the authors did a good job of presenting the results in a clear and concise manner. They used text and multiple tables and graphs, so they did a good job of that. It was good visually. They used the appropriate units of analysis presented in the results, and the data of all measures described in the methods were presented and analyzed in the study. Standard errors were presented for each variable, examining between group and within group outcomes at all 3 time points, but they did not talk about levels of variability of the data at all. And the authors did a good job of stating major findings in the discussion section. They also did a good job of discussing their contribution to the existing literature from previous research on the topics. They mentioned their strengths, the limitations and weaknesses, as you can see listed here. All right. And last slide, everything coming together. There were significant differences recorded in stress and psychological health markers within the 16-week yoga group. And all of these had a critical alpha set at 0.05. The Waycross group saw significant decreases in stress, anxiety, depression, and insomnia once they crossed over into doing yoga. The authors did comment on the generalizability of the study, saying that it may only be applicable to education workers and not necessarily any other professions. I think I mentioned that already. But previous research lacks real world yoga situations. They wanted to fix that and attempt to answer that call for non-clinical yoga research, and I think they did a good job of that. And that is my presentation. Thank you.